Author's introduction to the collection Real World, Letters from an Earthling to Planet Brazil, released on March 20th, 2007, at the Elizicos Cultural Center in São Paulo. I'm very pleased with the publication of this collection and grateful to the São Paulo Commercial Association, especially Guilherme Afif Domingos, Marcel Salimio, and Moises Rabanavasai, for the public recognition of the effort I've been putting into the real-world column in the Diário do Comércio. In a country where many flatter me in private only to later deny they know me, such a tribute presupposes no small amount of courage and integrity. What pleases me most is that the benefits of this recognition go far beyond the honoree himself, decisively contributing to expanding and consolidating the impact he seeks to achieve through his work. That impact rests on three goals. 1. To raise Brazilian awareness of the existence, operations, and dangers of the São Paulo Forum, exposing the inherently criminal nature of an entity in which politicians, terrorists, and drug traffickers, safe from public scrutiny, come together to plan the total conquest of power across the continent. 2. To alert readers to the massive, ongoing journalistic fraud that, for 16 years, hid this phenomenon, and which, once the silence was broken, has since worked tirelessly to minimize it ex post facto in an attempt to mitigate the scandal of its own complicity in the crime. 3. To introduce new concepts in political philosophy that help readers understand these two phenomena within the broader framework of emerging global power structures. Let me briefly analyze each of these points. 1. The secret government. By bringing together legal leftist parties with terrorist organizations and drug cartels from across Latin America, the São Paulo Forum is the most powerful political organization that has ever existed in the region. In all of Latin American history, no other entity has ever united so many leaders, heads of state, mafia bosses, and guerrilla commanders in a collective effort to seize continental power. Just one of its member groups, the FARC, Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, once had more financial and military resources than all the region's national armed forces combined. Logically speaking, any attempt to deny or question the essential importance of this entity in determining the course of Latin American history is either pure madness or deliberate deceit. I don't think there's any room for rational dispute on this point. Nor can one rationally deny the inherently criminal nature of this enterprise. The FARC case illustrates this with overwhelming clarity. While evidence surfaced showing that the Colombian narco-guerrilla was supplying 200 tons of cocaine annually to the domestic market, presidential candidate Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was meeting secretly with leaders of this criminal gang to discuss shared strategic interests and even signing manifestos in support of them. Once in office, he continued to participate in their meetings through his aide Gilberto Carvalho, exchanging favors and pleasantries with the megacriminals, helping to build with them a continental-scale power scheme. Even as Brazilian police uncovered FARC agents embedded in the criminal gangs terrorizing the streets of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. 2. The manufacture of secrecy. In any normal country, politicians involved in such a grotesque conspiracy would have been exposed, publicly shamed, arrested, tried, and convicted. The problem was that there were so many of these politicians, and they were precisely the ones whom the media had bet on as the anointed saviors of the nation. If the facts were to come out, if the crimes were judged for what they objectively were, the resulting public disillusionment with the left would have gone far beyond the outrage caused by mere corruption scandals, no matter how enormous in scale. It would have meant the end of the Brazilian left. But at that point, there was no longer any organized right capable of filling the vacuum. The few isolated right-wing figures that still lingered on the national stage were the infamous children of the dictatorship, whom the media despised more than the plague. Faced with the dreadful prospect of a right-wing resurgence, the self-appointed managers of public opinion decided it was better to pretend they had seen nothing and to shift the focus of public debate to secondary and peripheral issues. That was the moment Brazil gave up, once and for all, on being a normal country. It chose instead the psychotic denial of reality, diving headfirst into alienation and evasion. Please, do not even think of suggesting that this formidable coordination of silences was merely a coincidence. It is humanly inconceivable that so many newspaper editors, magazine directors, TV channel executives, newsroom chiefs, scandal-hungry reporters, and enlightened political commentators could have dozed off in unison for 16 years with the innocence of newborn babies. Despite all the warnings and evidence I kept spreading through the media, despite the countless alerts and furious letters of protest I sent them during that time. Such a colossal collective blunder, such a remarkable convergence of distractions, would amount to the greatest epidemic of incompetence ever witnessed in the history of global journalism. On its own, it would suffice to completely discredit the Brazilian press, to obliterate whatever shred of credibility it still had left, to destroy even the faintest pretext the public might still cling to for trusting the national media. But that's not what happened. The Brazilian media did not fail because of a monumental dose of incompetence, but because of an even greater dose of dishonesty and cynicism. Search history all you like. You will not find any comparable case of political amputation of news coverage on such a scale and for such a length of time in any democratic country. You will, of course, find a few in totalitarian regimes like the USSR, China, or Nazi Germany. To replicate such an achievement under democratic rule, an almost impossible feat, is a glory that no one can deny to Brazilian journalism. 3. Understanding the situation. Phenomena so monstrously abnormal do not occur just because. They reflect deep currents in the course of history, which manifest themselves through these events in partial and fragmented form, so that the public, seeing only surface-level novelty, fails to perceive the unity of the underlying process. This difficulty is twofold. On one hand, essential information may be lacking. Amid a flood of flashy headlines, the truly important facts slip by unnoticed by the daily media, which remains the primary source of information even for the educated classes. On the other hand, we lack the conceptual tools to place this information in a coherent, intelligible framework. Those tools are missing because most of the explanatory models circulating in public debate are deeply flawed. Some were crafted for earlier, more schematic situations. Others are mere stereotypes with zero cognitive value. Others still are just campaign slogans. Never has the country's situation been more complex, and never have the intellectual tools used to discuss it been more simplistic. This mismatch between national intelligence and the new problems arising from global historical, cultural, political, and economic transformations over the last 30 years has been further worsened by the fact that, precisely during this same period, the cultural and journalistic hegemony of the rising left transformed our cultural institutions into militant training centers, annihilating any prospect of genuine intellectual life. It goes without saying that even conservatives and liberals were affected by this process. Competing on a playing field previously marked out by their opponents, they agreed to limit national debate to narrow economic matters, defined for them by the very left they sought to oppose. The loss they suffered was double. On one hand, they handed over to the left a monopoly on cultural and moral issues of greatest public concern. On the other, they severely curtailed their own intellectual horizon, cutting themselves off from any deeper understanding of the larger transformations unfolding on the global stage. In the end, it was an entire culture, pre-molded by leftist hegemony, that worked against any effort to develop a clear and adequate view of the present condition of the country and the international forces shaping it. To elevate people above the limitations of their surrounding culture is, above all, the task of philosophy. It has nothing to do with cultural criticism, that bit of pretentious fluff invented by the Frankfurt School. Cultural criticism aims to undermine the foundations of a culture while proclaiming, at the same time, that human beings can never escape it, leaving only one possible option: to encourage everything within it that is negative, malicious, or criminal, and to transform it into a culture of self-hatred, a counterculture. It is the Hegelian idea of the work of the negative turned into cultural activism. One of its hallmark techniques is to devalue the dominant culture through unflattering comparisons with other cultures, granting the latter the benefit of relativism while pinning the former beneath the crushing demands of absolute moralism. Cultural criticism invented and spread the notion of asymmetric warfare. Philosophical analysis, by contrast, holds that any individual can transcend the limitations of their culture, for if this were not the case, any comparison between cultures would be impossible. Greek theater, the immediate forerunner of philosophy, occasionally chose a foreigner as the hero of its tragic plots, to teach the audience that compassion is universal, not confined by national or cultural borders. The facile denial of the possibility of knowing universal truths, the complete subjugation of man to cultural conditioning, is already a crime against intelligence. Cultural criticism exacerbates this crime by turning culture against itself and trapping men in an unbearable tangle of conflicts, from which they will seek relief in perfectly futile revolutionary outbursts. Once, a particularly cretinous television host, trying to make me jealous, said that the best cultural critic in Brazil was Sergio Augusto. I agreed. I am not, and never will be, a cultural critic. Any Sergio Augusto is more than enough for that. My business is not to turn culture into a mousetrap. It is to help people see beyond their culture, to show them that the mousetrap doesn't exist, except as a hypnotic illusion. To awaken people from the hypnotic sleep of recent Brazilian culture, it was necessary to completely rebuild a historical vision contaminated by unconscious Marxist reflexes. The theoretical work I developed for this purpose is recorded in lectures and course materials from classes taught at the Centro Universitário de Cidade do Rio de Janeiro in the 1990s, and especially at the Pontifical Catholic University of Paraná, PUCPR, between 2001 and 2005. The articles I published in Diário do Comércio, which form the core of this edition of Digesto Econômico, are practical illustrations of the concepts and methods presented in those lectures. Of course, they can be read and understood without that theoretical background. If I point out that such a background exists, it is only to emphasize that none of those articles are idle opinion or mere momentary effusions of personal impressions. Everything in them, except, obviously, for some lapses due to the haste of journalistic writing or the author's occasional inattention, has its reasons for being. These reasons are not always declared in the text, but extend all the way to the ultimate foundations of the issue at hand. This means that, in principle, for each assertion there is an entire backbone of logical and documentary evidence, which is not presented in full in the article itself, but has, in most cases, already been developed in lectures, debates, or conferences, and can be so again, if necessary. As for the theoretical foundations, the ones with the most practical relevance to the brief analyses found in these articles are historical sociological atomism, theory of the subject of history, theory of castes, theory of the four discourses. The first is a methodological precept, according to which any historical or sociological generalization that cannot be analytically broken down into the minimal individual acts and characters whose sum it comprises is nothing more than a figure of speech, and a deceptive one at that. If, for example, following the prevailing historiographic consensus shaped by Marxists, we say that in the French Revolution of 1789, the bourgeoisie took power, this sentence only makes sense if we can identify, among the movement's leaders, a significant number of capitalist entrepreneurs. The fact is, there were practically none. The French Revolution was an anti-capitalist, anti-bourgeois movement, which over time steered the French economy into statist and socialist directions, inevitably causing the decline of what had once been the richest and most powerful country in the world. The myth of the bourgeois revolution is perhaps the most haunting ghost ever to possess the minds of Brazilian sociologists and historians, infesting them with a multitude of lethal errors in the interpretation of our past and present. The theory of the subject of history states that no group, community, or entity of any kind can be the agent of historical transformation unless it meets three conditions. 1. It must possess a real unity, not merely symbolic or analogical. 2. This unity must be strong enough to determine by itself the values, preferences, and choices of the individuals that compose it. 3. It must continue to exist for a sufficient length of time to guarantee a continuity of action beyond the lifespan of these individuals. These conditions, though almost always overlooked by sociological interpreters of history, are obvious as soon as they are stated. In fact, they constitute the only identifiable content of the very concept of historical action. A superficial examination reveals that among the usual subjects of history, classes, nations, states, races, cultures, none meet all three conditions together. That is, They are not true subjects of history, but shadows cast by the true agents. True subjects of history, in the strict sense, are only the following. A. Churches and religious sects. B. Mystical, initiatory, and esoteric societies. C. Aristocratic and oligarchic dynasties. D. Political movements organized like religious sects or esoteric societies. There is no fifth historical agent. The study of extra-human historical factors, natural or supernatural, is a separate topic, too lengthy to address here. Nations, classes, states, etc. are scenes, locations, or objects of action, never agents. History narrated with these false agents as focal points produces symbolic and illusory causal continuities and linkages, like animal shapes formed by moving clouds. Behind these apparent connections, if you dig a little, you will always find the hand of the true agents. Many of the analyses I presented in Diario do Comercio are simply examples of applying this method. The theory of castes, which I adapted from the Hindu tradition, aims to uncover the truth behind the false historical identity of social classes and especially behind the myth of the class ideology. All supposed class ideologies were invented by one class alone, the intellectuals. They serve solely to cover up the political manipulation of other classes by the intellectuals. But the intellectuals are not, in any identifiable socioeconomic sense, a class. They are a caste. Castes are psychological types, generally distributed across various classes, and therefore are direct determinants of human behavior. They are not properly historical agents, but are the structural mold in which those agents are born and defined. For this reason, every historical action carries the mark of caste. The four castes have permanent existence, independent of socioeconomic structural variations. Recognizing the caste identity of historical agents is essential to understand the logic of their actions. The theory of the four discourses, the only one among those mentioned here that circulates in book form, is a study of the essential means of persuasion, and therefore of the means by which one person influences another. It helps to distinguish between the discourse of the agents of the process and the explanatory discourse of the analytical observer, a distinction which, according to Aristotle, marks the beginning of political science. This distinction leads to another, of immediate practical value. Every agent's discourse contains, in a compressed and indistinct way, two elements: the true or false data it possesses about the situation and the actions it intends to trigger with its discourse. The strength of its influence on listeners often depends on these two elements remaining blended. For that reason, every historical action contains a component of mystification, which can reach complete self-mystification. The analysis breaks down these factors, making the process intelligible in the same measure that it provides the means to neutralize, if necessary, the agent's force. Many of the articles I published in Diario do Comercio are nothing more than applications of this distinction, whose importance far exceeds mere scientific interest. My students, and the few readers of my books and course materials, clearly perceive that these articles, like any others I have published, are merely entry points to an entire network of underground connections. For other readers, this network remains invisible, but a little imagination is enough to suspect its existence, and a little intellectual sanity is enough to awaken the desire to seek it out, or at least to refrain from opining until more knowledge is obtained. Since imagination and intellectual sanity are almost completely lacking among media and university opinion makers, practically everything these gentlemen have written or said about my political thought, not to mention the well-informed opinions of semi-literate students who overcrowd internet discussion lists, is pure fantasy built on isolated fragments. I never expected anything else from them. In an abnormally busy life as a journalist, itinerant lecturer, editor of others' texts, micro-entrepreneur, virtual NGO worker, and now foreign correspondent, I have not had time to organize for publication the recordings and transcripts of my classes, which in the most modest estimate amount to 20,000 pages of text. I have not even been able to collect and publish newspaper articles in book form since the second volume of O Imbecile Cultivo. You can therefore imagine my joy when the Sao Paulo Commercial Association suggested the publication of this collection. It is the first step for the unity of my political thought and the philosophical elaboration beneath it, to begin to become visible outside my circle of students. As for the title, I believe I need not explain it much. Physically, Brazil seems still anchored to the ground, but psychologically it is wandering somewhere in the stratosphere. Without the slightest idea of what is going on in the world, it has opinions about everything and expresses them with a passion, a fury, that already proves to be the fruit of imaginary self-persuasion, always more exciting than mere observation of the facts. Hence the need for these letters from an Earthling, modest attempts to bring back to our old planet a nation lost in space.